Good morning. Happy Sabbath. Well, we have never been asked this request before. And actually, I've never been asked to give my testimony before. And for any of you that know me, you know that I don't really like to be up front. But you know, this is a testimony of God's love, His mercy, His long-suffering, His patience, and also His guidance and His leading. And I have to digress a little bit first, because I think that you need a little background to get a better picture of what the Lord has done. Because it's really a miracle of the Lord putting together two people that are totally opposite in personality, that came from totally different backgrounds, and that came from opposite ends of the earth. And only God can do that kind of thing. And so I'd like to start back in my childhood. I was born into a family that were not Adventist, of course. My mother was Presbyterian, and I don't really think my father was anything. And when we were quite small, my mother got a flyer in the mail that the title of it is What and Where is Heaven? And it interested her. And it was an evangelistic series, and so she went. And I'm assuming, I'm too young to remember some of these details, but I'm assuming my father went with her, because they both ended up being baptized. But unfortunately, my father had a lot of very, very bad habits. He drank, he smoked, and he gambled. And those three things are not a good combination. And my mother had come from a background of being an only child and a very conservative home. Parents didn't drink, didn't smoke, spiritually minded people. And so a few years into their marriage, I guess, and it was after my grandmother died, my father, he attended church for about 9 months, I think. And after that, he just totally turned his back on it. And, you know, we've been told that people who once know the truth and turn from the truth, they're worse than if they never knew it. And that was definitely the case with him. By the time I was about 6 years old, my mother owned her own home. She had money in the bank. My mother was well taken care of. By the time I was 6 years old, my father had gambled every bit of that away. He lied to my mother to get the house sold. At any rate, long story short, there's a lot of stories that I could tell that he ended up leaving, and he left the 6 of us in a 13-foot camp trailer. And we were there for probably close to a year. I don't know exactly how long, because I was young. But it got to the point my mom didn't even have the money to pay the rent, because he left a lot of bills behind, too. And she didn't even have the money to pay the rent. And that's when the Adventist church really helped us a lot. They moved us into, they had a campground there where there was a kitchen, and they moved our whole family in there. And when camp meeting came, we all moved everything we owned into a tent. And then after that, they got us moved into some government housing, which was, in those days, they'd never have anything like that today, but it was, the best way to describe it was like an asbestos matchbox. It was just a square place. So when we were in that place, my father came back, and he stayed there for a while, but he drank a lot. It was a very poor neighborhood. Now, don't misunderstand me. My father was a very intelligent man, and he had a very good job, but he had so many bad habits that they overruled any of the good things. And so we finally got moved to a brick duplex, and my father left again. And after that, I never saw my father again. When I was in my early teens, and I hope I can do this without getting too emotional, when I was in my early teens, my mother was killed in a car wreck. And I was very close to my mother. We related. I loved her, and I knew she loved me. And even all the trauma that went on in life, I could always count on my mother. And when she was gone, it was like my whole world fell apart. It was very difficult. And when I look back, I really think how good God was to me. Because, you know, you see a lot more when you look back than when you're going through an experience. And I realized that I could have been so open to spiritualism, because I would go shopping And I would just think I would go around the corner and meet my mother. I would dream about my mother. And it was very, very difficult, a very difficult year. I didn't do well in school. I don't know, it changed my entire life. We became wards of state, and I had a very good friend. And she took me into, when I found out my mother had been killed, it was like hours and hours before I could even cry. I just screamed and screamed and screamed. I couldn't believe it. And so anyway, this family, I was very good friends with this particular family. So the night my mother was killed, she wasn't the one driving. And that's another whole long story in itself. But my sister and I were home by ourselves. My two brothers had gone with her. My brothers weren't driving either. They were both several years younger than me. And so the car had gone over the edge of a 200-foot cliff. But that night, my sister and I and my sister's boyfriend had stayed over to our house to keep us safe. And so when the police came and told us what had happened, they said, well, let's go to the pastor's house. Well, you have a problem? Where do you go? The pastor's house, of course. So we went to the pastor's house, and I just couldn't seem to face seeing anybody except my very closest friend. So I said, when they said, well, what are we going to do with these kids, you know? I said, can we please go to their house? And this family was so kind to us. They took all four of us in. When I said 5 before, there were 6 of us. My great aunt lived with us. She was mentally retarded. She was my mother's aunt. And so she actually, I think they took her to a nursing home or something. I don't really know what happened to her. But this family took all 4 of us children, and they actually built an extension on their home for us. And I feel really bad because I don't think my sister and my brothers really appreciated all that this family did for us, but they did a lot for us. It was I could never call her mom because she was so not like my mother, but she was very kind. They were very, very, very kind family to us. My sister eventually got very upset, and she left and went with my father's relatives. And, I just had this yearning in my heart that I wanted to get away from all the memories I had grown up with, because none of them were very pleasant memories. And I had a couple of other friends that had talked about going to nursing school. And so I went and talked to them, and I said, you guys, you still thinking about going to nursing school? Because this isn't what I had planned to do, actually. But I thought, well, at least it would get me away from here. And so they said, yeah. So I said, okay, let's apply. Let's see, maybe we can all go together. And the Lord worked it out that all 3 of us got to go together to nursing school, which was really good. And so when I was in nursing school, it was during the 60s, and so the Vietnam War was going on, and so a lot of the soldiers, especially the Adventist soldiers, because I had gone to public school all my life, but when I went to college, I chose to go to an Adventist nursing school. But I have to tell you, my life was definitely not going in the right direction. Definitely not. I mean, my thinking was, if there's really a God, how can he let all these things happen? And as a teenager, I guess it was a pretty typical kind of reaction. And so I wasn't really going to church. I wasn't doing anything really spiritual. In fact, like I said, I was going the exact opposite direction. And so we were at supper one night. There was a whole bunch of us at the table in the cafeteria, and there was a young man there that was on leave from Vietnam. And so he said, you know what, there's a lot of lonely guys over there in Vietnam that they would really love to have somebody to write to as a pen pal. And then when they get leave, if they can come to Australia, they have somebody who can show them around. And so he had a piece of paper, and he handed it around the table, and we all wrote our name, and we all had the same address, so that wasn't difficult. And, I never thought another thing about it. And I don't know how long it was later, maybe 6 weeks later, I got this letter from Wilbur Atwood. And I said, Wilbur Atwood. Now, I have to tell you something else, too. In life, I had not had a lot of good experiences with men. So men and marriage was not on my agenda at all. And I said many times, I will stay single for the rest of my life before I will live in the hell that my mother lived in. And so that was not a priority in my life, believe me. I had planned when I graduated from nursing that I was going to go on and get my second degree in obstetrics, and I had my whole life planned out, and marriage was not part of it. And so, coincidentally, Wolf was actually writing to 2 different girls at the hospital there, and we were classmates. And so we knew eventually he would get a leave and come to Australia. And so I said, her name was Yvonne, I said, Yvonne, you know what, when this guy comes, just be sure that you're the one that's off and I'm the one that's working. But somehow or other, I don't know what happened, but the date got changed several times, and as Providence would have it, the day that he arrived, or the night before, I was off the next day, and she was working, scheduled to work. I said, okay. So I met him that evening, and he was staying with one of the staff there, one of the staff housing down the road. And so we decided that the next day we would go to Sydney and go on one of these day harbor cruises that they have, where they have a little island you can take and have a picnic and so on and so forth. And so we did. He came, picked me up in the morning. We went into Sydney, and I said, wow, this guy is really nice. He's different than any other guy I ever met. And for some reason, I trusted him, and I didn't trust guys at all. Believe me, I did not trust them. Because I had several experiences during my childhood that had just instilled that in me, I guess. And so, but he was very nice, and we related very well. I could talk to him very easily. And so I came back to the dorm, and I started talking to my friends. I said, hey, can anybody work for me tomorrow? Or can I pay you to work for me? Or whatever, can you switch with me? And I have this day off, and I'll give it to you, and I'll work for you. And somehow or other, I managed to get every day off except one of his whole leave. And we related very, very well. So then instead of exchanging letters like every 2 or 3 weeks, because he would write and I would write and he would write and I would write back. So we somewhat knew each other before we met, because I don't know how many months we were writing, maybe, I have no idea. That was many years ago. Maybe 6 months, I don't know. But anyway, when he went back, he really prayed that he could have a second leave. Now, second leaves just didn't happen. Not to Australia. I mean, you would get a second leave, but not to Australia. Nobody got 2 leaves to Australia. But he had prayed for that. He actually extended over there so he could get out of service earlier. And the Lord gave him a second leave, and he came back to Australia. Well, by the time he left the second time, we were talking about getting married. Now, listen, I don't recommend this form of courtship, but like I say, we didn't understand wildwood principles or anything like that. And I think my parents, my foster parents, were a little bit uneasy about it. My mom had told me, you know, Jeanette, if you go there and everything doesn't work out, you know you always have a home, you can come home, but before you're married, not after. And she made that very clear. And you know, my mother had raised us kids with very good moral principles and very good, you know, my mom, I don't think she knew a lot spiritually. I'd never heard of spirit of prophecy. I'd never heard of anything they teach at Wildwood, and even not a lot of things they teach with the Adventist Church, because I'd always gone to public school. I'd gone to school dances and socials and drive-in movies and all the things that the world did. We went to church on Sabbath, and that was about the only difference that I could tell from any other person. And so, so then we had decided to get married, but that was, you know, I was in Australia, he was in America. And of course, obviously, I had to come here. So I stayed until I graduated, but I had been working a lot. I was sitting my state hospital finals, I was sitting state finals, I was working full-time, I went to school full-time, and on the side, I was babysitting to earn extra money. So I was getting very little sleep, and I was working day and night. And so I graduated, and by the time I graduated, I already had my visa, my ticket, and everything to go. And I don't remember if it was graduation night or the very next day, I got sick. And I mean, I got really sick. I could not move. I came down with double bronchopneumonia and pleurisy in both my lungs. And they immediately wanted me to put me in the hospital there. And I told them, no, please don't put me in the hospital here, because I knew what my plans were. And I was kind of a determined individual, I guess. And so I said, my girlfriend's here, her mom's here. Can you please just let me go home? I have my mom at home, my foster sister was at home. I said, I know they'll take care of me. Please let me go. So believe it or not, they let me go home. And I was sick. I remember my mom coming in there and said, do you think she's going to make it? And the doctor came to the house in those days. But it took me, I think, about a week before I could even get the strength to get in the shower. I mean, I was really, really sick. And all this time, my husband, he has his own, maybe he should come and start sharing. He had his own prayers and his own things, so.
I was getting a little nervous that we made a decision to marry so soon. And so I really felt the need for the Lord to make it plain. And I said, I was like Gideon, I put up a fleece. We had set a date for her to arrive. And I said, if she doesn't get here on that date, then we don't marry.
Well, you know, also, when after I met him, and I understood a little bit of, there were two professions I said I would never marry. I would never marry a doctor. I had worked with enough of them to know that I didn't want to marry a doctor, and I'd never marry a pastor. Because I figured doctors and pastors, their lives were never their own. So those two I had decided were out. Anything else, a school teacher maybe, where they got the summer off, and, you know, that would be okay. But not a doctor, not a pastor. And so, but I knew, you know, what his goals were and what his dreams were. And you know, from a different perspective, it really brought me back to God, because I realized I didn't want a mistake either, because I didn't want to be in a situation like my mother was in. So I knew I knew enough about God to know I had to have him in my life, and I had to have him leading me. So it really was a turning point in my life of turning me back to God, to depend on him, to know that he was really leading me.
Now, to back up a little bit, before I went in the service, I was determined not to go if I possibly could avoid it. And so I first, since I had graduated from college with a theology degree, I went to the conference. They had given me a little money one time to help in my schooling. So I went to them and said, can you take me on as a pastor? And they said, well, we don't have any needs right now. So that door closed. Then I hope the sequence is right, you know, but then I got drafted. And so then they had a program in Washington, D.C. area called White Coats. And the White Coat program was young men that were given various diseases, kind of a, you know, a testing thing, but you didn't have to go to Vietnam. So I thought, well, that's good, if I can get in that. But they wouldn't take me in that. I guess they were full at the time. And so then I ended up getting my orders to go to Fort Sam Houston and a report there to be trained as a medic. Well, during the time of my training as a medic, I learned that they needed some computer people, and I had been working in the Adventist hospital in Washington in the computer department. And so I made application to be taken into the computer area. And actually, my papers arrived to go to Fort Benning in Georgia. And that was right next to Uchee Pines, but I didn't know anything about Uchee Pines.
There was no Uchee Pines in those days.
Yeah. And so just when my papers came through that I had orders to go to Fort Benning, Vietnam made a call for 2,000 medics. So they withheld the papers so that I couldn't go to Fort Benning, and I had to go to Vietnam. However, I praise the Lord for that now.
You know, sometimes in life, our biggest trials, the things that are the most difficult for us, really turn out to be the greatest blessings of our life. And you know, I can truly say, God has been so good. I mean, my husband probably doesn't want me to say this, he probably wouldn't want me to say this, but honestly, God gave me the best husband in the world for me. I mean, we are, even though we are totally opposites, we are totally compatible. And I think we complement each other, and he has taught me so much that, you know, some people, I've been around long enough and seen enough and heard enough, gone to enough pastors' meetings and enough other things and listened to pastors' wives, and I just can't relate. I honestly can't relate, because everything my husband is in the pulpit, he is in the home. He is the most kind, patient, and loving person I have ever met in my life, bar none. And so I see that God has been very good to us, to both of us, and I just thank him for his goodness and his leading.
She's pretty easy to live with, too. One other thing we'll share. After I began trying to find a way to bring my wife over, I didn't want to marry her and bring her over then, because
And I didn't want to do that in case when I got here I decided this wasn't for me.
Yeah, so, you know, how to get her over to this country and without marrying her was kind of a barrier, even though we'd already decided we'd like to get married. So one day I was working in the bakery at the Washington Adventist Hospital. Or maybe I had worked in the bakery before, and so the guy that was the main baker came to me one day and he said, they just passed a new ruling that if you found somebody overseas that you wanted to marry, there's a special visa you can apply for, and you've got to marry them within 90 days of when they get to this country. So I said, wow. And so I went down to the office in Washington, D.C., and I asked them about it, and they said, yeah, we have that provision. In fact, you're the first person that ever asked for it. And so that was the way the Lord opened the door so that we were able to bring my fiance over. And maybe I should mention this. Well, back in those days, it was pretty expensive to call. So I think we only called a couple of times.
Twice.
One phone bill for one call was $75. Nowadays, you can talk for almost nothing.
I thought it was 120 and 80, but close
maybe.
anyway. It was expensive. And we didn't talk that long, maybe 20 or 40 minutes, something like that. Things have changed a lot since those days.
So we were still writing, and when she got sick, I thought, well, maybe the Lord's going to keep her from arriving on the date, and I'd made that a definite sign in my mind.
And I didn't know anything about that.
No, she didn't know. And amazingly enough, she got well enough to arrive on the exact date that we had set. And we had most of the 90 days to continue our relationship to decide what the Lord had in mind. And by that time, I was totally convinced that she was the one for me.
And I have to say, I honestly wondered if he would even recognize me, or I was a wreck. I can tell you, I was really a wreck. It took me about a year to get over that sickness, but God is good.